Frank Delaney hadn't been to the county fairgrounds in nearly 3 years. Ever since Irene passed, nothing about the world felt quite right. But something about that cloudy Saturday morning pulled him back. The air smelled like wet hay and fried dough, and the sound of distant neighing echoed through the auction lot. He walked slowly between the metal pens, eyes landing on a tall, chestnut mare with scars along her flank. She was skittish, pacing in small circles. "Lot 112, the auctioneer barked. Frank didn't know why, but he raised his hand. The bidding ended quick. No one wanted the horse with the nervous eyes and a trembling leg. Frank paid cash, and one of the handlers led him toward the old livestock trailer parked out back. As he approached, something felt off. The horse had already been loaded. But when Frank opened the rear gate to check her hooves, he froze. In the dim corner of the trailer, behind a stack of hay bales, a pair of legs, human legs, stuck out from the shadows. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped up, heart pounding. "Ma'am?" he said cautiously. The legs didn't move. Then slowly, a figure shifted into view. A woman, mid-30s maybe, wearing a tattered dress, dirt on her face, arms wrapped around herself like a child. Her eyes were wide, wild, and full of something Frank hadn't seen in years, absolute terror. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." But she didn't answer. She didn't even blink. Back at the fairgrounds, Sheriff Wade Brody was grabbing a hot dog when Frank found him. "You need to come with me," Frank said, voice low. Wade followed, no questions asked. They'd fought in the Gulf together. Trust came without explanation. When Wade climbed into the trailer and saw the woman, he stepped back. "Who the hell is she?" he asked. Frank shook his head. "I don't know. She was just there." The sheriff tried speaking to her, but she flinched at every sound. Frank noticed her wrist, bruises, dark and recent. Someone had hurt her. Badly. Wade called for an ambulance and child services, but Frank didn't move. His eyes were locked on her face. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, a flicker in her expression, a shape in her jaw. He couldn't explain it, but deep down, he knew, this wasn't just a stranger. As the sirens approached and Wade radioed for backup, Frank stood silently beside the trailer. The wind picked up, rustling the hay. The mare inside neighed softly, as if sensing the storm that had just begun. Frank didn't know it yet, but his life and hers had just collided in a way that neither of them could ever have imagined. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and stillness. Margot Hayes, as the sheriff would later learn her name to be, sat upright in the bed, staring blankly at the wall. She hadn't spoken since they pulled her from the trailer. No one knew how long she'd been in there. The nurse tried offering soup, then tea, then silence. Margot took none of it. She just clutched the thin blanket around her shoulders, eyes flicking to the corners of the room like she expected someone to burst in and drag her away. Frank stood in the hallway just outside, hat in hand, boots muddy from the auction grounds. He didn't belong here. Hospitals made him anxious. Too many memories of Irene hooked up to beeping machines, slipping away one breath at a time. But something kept him rooted there. Not obligation. Not curiosity. It was something deeper. That same feeling he'd had when he looked into the trailer, a strange tug in his gut that this woman was tied to him in ways he couldn't explain. Sheriff Wade Brody paced beside him, glancing occasionally through the glass. "Doctors say she's physically okay. Dehydrated. Exhausted. No signs of substance abuse. But mentally, she's somewhere else." Frank nodded slowly. "She said anything yet?" Wade shook his head. "Not a word. Not even her name. But I ran her prints. Found a partial match from a missing persons case. 6 years ago. Disappeared from 2 states over. Father reported her missing. Said she ran off with some man. That's all we've got." Inside the room, Margot turned her head. Just slightly. Enough to catch Frank watching her. For a moment, the briefest flash, something moved across her face. Recognition? Fear? He couldn't tell. But it was enough. Frank opened the door slowly and stepped in. He didn't say anything at first. Just sat in the chair beside her and let the silence stretch. "You were hiding," he finally said. "Behind the hay. Like you knew someone might come looking." Her lip trembled, but she didn't speak. Frank continued. "People don't hide like that unless they're running from something. Or someone." He paused. "You don't have to tell me who. Not now. But I think you're safe here." Margot's fingers tightened on the blanket. She turned her face away, but a single tear slipped down her cheek. Outside, the storm clouds gathered over the quiet town. And back in the sheriff's office, the fax machine sputtered to life, spitting out a report from the missing persons database. At the bottom of the page was a name Frank hadn't heard in over 20 years. A name that would crack open everything he thought he knew. The sheriff's office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same squeaky door hinges, same coffee stains on the floor, and the same wooden desk Sheriff Wade Brody had inherited from his father. He rubbed his temples as the fax printed its last line. The report was brief, but one detail made his chest tighten. Victor Hayes, primary contact on the original missing person case. Wade hadn't heard that name since he was a deputy in Shelby County. Back then, Victor was a big man with bigger influence. Oil, land, and connections that reached far beyond state lines. He opened the old drawer on the left side of his desk and pulled out a manila folder, thick with forgotten paperwork. Inside was a single letter, yellowed and folded. Irene Delaney had written it 15 years ago, months before her death. Wade had kept it, unsure why, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of instinct. Now, reading it again under the flickering light, something clicked. Irene had mentioned a girl with sea-glass eyes and a birthmark behind her ear. The exact words stuck with him. Sea-glass eyes. Just like the woman in the hospital bed. Meanwhile, at the farm, Frank stood at the edge of the pasture. The mare he'd bought, now named June, grazed cautiously near the fence. He hadn't spoken a word since returning home. His thoughts kept circling the same questions. Who was Margot? Why did she look so familiar? And why had her last name, Hayes, rattled something deep in his chest? He went to the barn, pulled down an old photo album, and opened to a page he hadn't looked at in decades. There, among the black and white photos, was one from a 4th of July picnic. Irene smiling, holding a baby girl who wasn't theirs. Frank had forgotten that summer. A brief, strange time when Irene took in the child of a friend in trouble, just for a few months. That baby had sea-glass eyes and a faint birthmark behind her ear. His hands trembled as he closed the book. He wouldn't believe it. But the math lined up. The feeling he'd had from the start wasn't just instinct. It was memory. Back at the hospital, Margot finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "He'll find me," she said, eyes locked on the window. "He always does." Nurse Janet McCree leaned in. "Who?" Margot swallowed. "My father." In that moment, miles apart, both Frank and Wade came to the same quiet conclusion. The past hadn't just come knocking. It had kicked the door off its hinges. Frank sat alone at his kitchen table, the morning sun barely warming the chipped wood beneath his hands. The house was too quiet. He hadn't slept much. His mind had spent the night digging through memories he thought were long gone. That summer, all those years ago, when Irene insisted on taking in a baby, just until things settled. He remembered pushing back, nervous about the responsibility. But Irene had been so sure. "She needs somewhere safe," she had said. "Just for a while." Now, Frank wondered if that while had never truly ended. Down at the sheriff's office, Wade Brody stared at the missing persons file again, his coffee going cold. Victor Hayes. The name echoed like a warning. Wade had encountered him once during an investigation. Slick talker, expensive suits, and eyes that never quite smiled. There were rumors back then. Bribes, disappearances, women going quiet after coming forward. But Victor's money always made problems vanish. Until now. If Margot really was his daughter, and if she ran, there had to be a reason far worse than the bruises on her wrist. At the hospital, Margot sat up in bed, hands trembling as she folded and unfolded the corner of her sheet. Nurse Janet stood by with cautious eyes. "He's not coming here," she said softly. "We've alerted the local authorities." Margot shook her head. "You don't know him." Her voice cracked. "He has people. Friends in uniforms. I tried to leave before. They always brought me back." She looked up then, finally meeting Janet's eyes. "This time, I left something behind. Something he wants." On the edge of town, Betty Lou grimly stood watering her front garden when she saw the black SUV drive by slowly. Tinted windows, out-of-state plates. She narrowed her eyes. The car passed once, then again. Too clean. Too quiet. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked inside, dialing Frank's number. "I don't know what you've gotten mixed up in," she said when he picked up. "But there's trouble circling the block like a hungry dog." Frank's heart thudded. He hung up, grabbed his keys, and headed back to the hospital. But halfway there, he pulled over to the side of the road, the same stretch of highway where he once taught his daughter to drive. His hands gripped the steering wheel. His daughter. Could it be? Had Irene hidden the truth even from him? The photo. The letter. The way Margot had looked at him. Not with fear, but something closer to recognition. And just like that, the past wasn't a ghost anymore. It had a name, a face, and it was staring straight back at him. The black SUV pulled into the hospital parking lot just before sunset. A tall man stepped out, his boots polished, his suit sharp as a blade. He walked with the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no a day in his life. The front desk nurse glanced up and immediately straightened. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice suddenly tight. The man offered a cold smile. "Yes. I'm looking for my daughter, Margot Hayes." His voice was silk over steel. The nurse hesitated, glancing toward the security desk, but he was already walking past her. Margot felt it before anyone told her. Something in her chest tightened, her breath catching mid-inhale. She stood from the bed, hands gripping the stand like a shield. "He's here," she whispered. Nurse Janet looked up sharply. "How do you—" "I just know," Margot said. "He always finds me." Panic flashed in her eyes. "You have to get me out of here." Janet moved fast, calling for security, but Margot was already slipping on her shoes with shaking hands. Frank pulled into the lot just as the commotion began. He saw a tall figure walking toward the elevators, and something instinctual surged through him. Rage, fear, protectiveness, he wasn't even sure. He ran inside, just as Margot came out the stairwell on the other end of the hallway, barefoot and breathless. Their eyes locked for a split second. Frank stepped forward, and she stopped. Her voice was shaky, but clear. "His name's not just Victor Hayes. That's not who he really is." Sheriff Wade burst in moments later, hand on his holster. "We have a situation," he said. "Man in the lobby matches Victor Hayes' photo. But here's the thing, Frank, there's no active warrant on him. No legal way to hold him. Yet." Frank clenched his fists. "She's terrified of him." Wade nodded grimly. "And that might be enough to keep her here. But if he gets to a judge first? He could claim she's unstable, take her right back." Margot sat quietly as they spoke. Then she reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a small, folded paper. Her hands trembled as she handed it to Wade. "I was going to burn this," she said softly. "But maybe now, maybe it matters." Wade opened the paper and read in silence. When he looked up, his face had lost all color. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Margot met his eyes. "From his study. The night I ran." Outside, the man in the suit stood calmly beneath the hospital awning, watching the second-floor window. He smiled to himself, not because he had found her, but because he already knew what she was about to remember. Sheriff Wade sat in his cruiser long after the hospital visit, the letter still open in his lap. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, a woman's hand. Margot had said she found it in Victor's study, hidden beneath a drawer lining. Dated over 25 years ago, it was addressed not to Victor, but to Irene Delaney. "I did what you asked," it read. "The child is safe. But this cannot come back to me. If he finds out, there will be no mercy for either of us." No signature. Just a smudge of ink where a name had once been. Frank paced inside his barn, the weight of the past pressing down on him like summer heat. Irene had secrets, that much was clear now. But had she been protecting someone, or hiding something from him? The baby in that photograph, the way she'd fought to keep her even when Frank resisted, it all made sense now. Margot wasn't just a stranger or some missing girl. She had been here before. She had been theirs. Or close to it. And Irene, always calm, always measured, had taken that secret to her grave. Back at the hospital, Margot stood by the window, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She remembered the letter too, not just what it said, but how it smelled. Like old wood and cigar smoke. Victor's study had always been locked. The one night he forgot, she found more than she'd ever expected. Photos of a younger Irene, a checkbook with large withdrawals to a private clinic, and that letter. A name had been scratched out, but the paper had been thin, and under the right light, one word still showed faintly. "Daughter." Wade returned that evening with a heavy look in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said to both Frank and Margot. They sat around the same kitchen table where Irene once served coffee and secrets. "I think Irene helped hide you," Wade began. "Your father, Victor, he may have had legal custody, but it looks like your mother made a desperate deal to keep you away from him. Irene might have been the one who took you in, maybe even planned it all." Frank felt the words hit like a punch to the chest. "Are you saying she's my daughter?" Wade paused. "It's not confirmed. But that letter, those photos, everything points to it." Margot looked down, eyes wide with something between hope and grief. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. Outside, another car pulled slowly into town, unnoticed. In the passenger seat sat a woman with tired eyes, clutching a photo of Irene Delaney, and holding a secret that would unravel the rest. The knock on the door came just as the sun was dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows through Frank's kitchen window. He opened it to find a woman standing alone on the porch. Mid-50s, dark hair pulled back, worn travel bag slung over one shoulder. Her eyes were tired, but sharp, the kind that had seen too much and forgotten too little. She held out a photograph without saying a word. Frank took it slowly. Irene. Young, smiling, holding hands with this same woman in front of a white picket fence. On the back, in faded pen, "To Evelyn for everything." "My name is Evelyn Monroe," she said. "I need to speak with Margot." "And with you." Frank stepped aside without a word. Inside, Margot sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph with quiet disbelief. "You were friends with Irene?" she asked, voice fragile. Evelyn gave a sad smile. "We were more than friends. We were sisters by choice. When you were born, I was there. Your mother, the woman who gave birth to you, she was scared. She didn't trust Victor. And she was right not to. Frank leaned forward. So Irene helped take Margot? Evelyn shook her head. Not take. Rescue. Your wife and I worked together to get Margot away from him before he could take full custody. He had people everywhere. Lawyers, judges, even police in his pocket. Irene used her name, her quiet reputation, to hide Margot in plain sight for nearly a year. Until someone tipped him off. Margot's hands were trembling now. That's when he came for me, isn't it? Evelyn nodded. And Irene, to protect you both, sent you back to me, but Victor found out. Wade, who had arrived moments before, listened silently as Evelyn laid it all out. I ran with her for a while, she continued. Different names, different states. But he kept coming. And then, one day, she was just gone. A motel room emptied. No note. I thought he'd found her and dealt with her. Her voice broke. But she must have come back here. She must have thought it was safer. Frank's throat was dry. Why come now? Evelyn looked at him, eyes heavy with guilt. Because I saw her face in the newspaper. Your auction. The horse. The girl in the trailer. I recognized Margot instantly. I realized she was still alive. And if she's alive, Victor will never stop. Outside, headlights flicked through the trees. The black SUV was back. But this time, he wasn't alone, and what he brought with him would force Frank, Margot, and Evelyn to make an impossible decision before sunrise. The knock this time wasn't polite. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind that made the house go still. Frank stepped away from the window slowly, shotgun resting against the doorframe more for comfort than threat. Evelyn stood by Margot, her hand wrapped protectively around the girl's wrist. Sheriff Wade Brody had his hand near his holster, eyes fixed on the door. No one said a word. The knock came again, louder now, followed by a familiar voice. Come. Called. Frank. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Victor Hayes stepped into the porch light like a man arriving to collect a debt. His suit was spotless, his expression unreadable. Behind him, two men stood in silence, dressed like security, but with eyes too cold and too sharp. I've come to retrieve my daughter, he said, as if it were a simple business transaction. I trust we can do this without trouble. Frank didn't move. She's not going anywhere. Wade stepped up behind him. You're trespassing, Hayes. And unless you've got a court order, you're not taking anyone. Victor smiled, like a man who'd already won. I filed the papers. Temporary custody. Emergency mental health evaluation. Signed by Judge Merriweather just this morning. He pulled the folded document from his coat pocket and handed it to Wade. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he scanned the page. It was real. Legal. Margot's voice cracked behind them. He forged that. He always does. But legally, it didn't matter. The paper gave Victor the right to take her, tonight. Frank stared at the paper, then at the man in front of him. She's not safe with you. She never was. Victor's smile faded. And who exactly are you, Frank? A man with a dead wife and no legal claim? A broken-down farmer playing hero in a drama that's long past you. Frank's voice lowered. I'm the man who remembers her eyes. From a summer when your name wasn't even whispered. I'm the one she trusted, even before she could speak. Evelyn stepped forward. You want proof, she said, pulling out a USB drive from her coat. Hospital records. Clinic logs. DNA results. Documents from the private investigator Irene hired. They all say the same thing. Margot isn't just your daughter. She's your prisoner. And we're done hiding. Victor hesitated. Just a flicker, but it was enough. Wade grabbed the USB, turning toward his cruiser. "If what's on this is what she says, you're not going anywhere tonight, Victor." And then, from behind Victor's car, headlights flared, another vehicle pulling in fast. A woman stepped out, breathless, with an envelope clutched in her hand. She looked at Frank, then Margot, then Victor. "I have something you all need to see," she said, "because none of you know the whole truth." The woman who stepped from the car looked nothing como Victor. She had soft, weathered features and eyes full of urgency. "My name is Lillian Archer," she said, breath-catching. "I used to work at the Hillcrest Clinic, where Margot was born." She held up a thick envelope. "These are sealed records. Ones I was ordered to destroy. But I didn't." Her hands trembled as she extended it to Sheriff Wade. "Because I knew one day someone would come looking for the truth." Wade opened the envelope carefully, his eyes scanning the papers inside. Then his brow furrowed, and he looked up, not at Lillian, but at Frank. "You need to hear this," he said. The documents weren't just medical charts. They included a notarized statement from a doctor, a birth certificate with a redacted name, and at the bottom, a DNA report. It showed a match not between Victor and Margot, but between Frank Delaney and Margot Hayes. Silence fell like a hammer. Frank stared at the paper, unmoving. "That can't be right," he whispered. Lillian stepped forward. "It is. Irene came to the clinic alone. She used another name. She told the doctor the father didn't know. She wanted to keep the baby safe, from everyone, even you." Frank's breath grew shallow. "She told me she couldn't have children," Lillian nodded. "She lied. Maybe to protect you. Maybe to protect Margot. But biologically and legally, you are her father." Margot backed away, tears filling her eyes. "So everything was a lie?" she asked, her voice breaking. "All these years, all this pain, and no one ever told me?" Frank stepped toward her, his own voice shaking. "If I'd known, I swear." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. It's too late." Victor, who had remained frozen through the exchange, suddenly exploded. "This is absurd. That's junk science. None of it proves a thing." But his voice was no longer commanding. It was panicked. For the first time, he looked like a man losing control. Sheriff Wade pulled the cuffs from his belt. "Actually, Victor, it does prove something." He held up the birth certificate. "This is fraud. You lied about custody. You forged documents. That makes every action since, including tonight, a criminal offense." As he read Victor his rights, Margot stood between Frank and Evelyn, shaking, uncertain, but no longer hiding. She looked up at Frank, searching for something real, something true. And in his eyes, she saw it, pain, yes, but also love. The lights of the cruiser flashed red and blue across the trees as Victor was led away. But no one inside the farmhouse spoke. Because even though justice had arrived, healing had only just begun. A week had passed since Victor Hayes was taken away in handcuffs, but his shadow still lingered over the quiet farmhouse. Margot sat on the porch swing, wrapped in one of Irene's old quilts. The early morning mist clung to the trees, and the only sound was the rhythmic creak of the swing and the distant snort of June, the mare, in the pasture. Frank stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee and handed her one without saying a word. She took it with a nod, still adjusting to what the word father now meant. Inside, Evelyn had taken over the guest room, sorting through boxes of Irene's things that had been untouched for years. She found more letters, some unfinished, some never sent. In one, Irene wrote, "If she ever comes back, tell her she was never unwanted. She was always loved, even when I couldn't say it out loud." Evelyn folded the letter and slipped it into Margot's bag without telling her. Some truths, she believed, were better discovered when the heart was quiet enough to receive them. Sheriff Wade visited once a day, checking in on Margot and keeping them updated. Victor was facing a list of charges that grew longer by the hour. But for Margot, the legal outcome mattered less than what had finally been taken away from him: power. For the first time, she could breathe without fear. She could sleep without listening for footsteps in the dark. And yet, the deepest wounds weren't visible. They would take longer to heal. Frank tried not to push. He worked the land, fed the animals, and fixed up the old barn like he had for years. But now, when he came in at dusk, there were 2 plates on the table. He started leaving the kitchen light on at night, just in case she needed it. And one evening, Margot spoke first. "You knew horses before you knew me," she said, watching June graze. Frank smiled faintly. "But I think you both saved me just the same." The days grew longer, and so did their conversations. Slowly, laughter returned to the house, quiet at first, then stronger. Margot found old photos of herself as a toddler in Irene's closet. Frank found a dusty box of Irene's favorite records and played them every evening. They didn't talk about the years they'd lost. They focused instead on the moments they still had left. And one morning, as the sun rose over the field, Margot led June out to pasture and turned to Frank. "I think I'm ready," she said softly. He looked at her, unsure. "Ready for what?" She smiled. "To stay."